Jack McCall was no stranger to the harshness of the desert. For decades he had carved out a living on the edge of a vast, unforgiving wilderness that stretched beyond the horizon like a burnt orange sea. The sun hung low, casting long shadows. Across his weathered ranch, a handful of rough-hewn buildings surrounded by parched earth and thorny scrub. This land had hardened him. Years of isolation and grit had etched lines into his sunburned face, and his steel-gray eyes had seen more than their share of hardship. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the towering mesas, Jack saddled his horse and set out on his usual inspection of the outer fences. The dry wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and the silence was thick, broken only by the faint jingle of his spurs and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. His instincts, sharpened by years alone, suddenly prickled. Something was wrong. Rounding a rocky outcrop, Jack spotted a faint figure lying motionless in the dirt. As he drew closer, the setting sun caught on matted hair and the pale face of a young native girl. She was barely breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. Her clothes were torn and stained with dust and dried blood, and her skin was caked with grime and sweat. Jack's first instinct was suspicion. Stray animals or hostile men often meant trouble, but the sight of the girl, so vulnerable and broken, stirred something buried deep within him. Without a second thought, he dismounted and knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her face. "Hey, little one," he muttered, voice rough but low. "You're gonna be all right. Just hold on." He tore a strip from his own shirt and fashioned a makeshift bandage around her arm, where a deep gash oozed dark blood. He poured water from his canteen over her cracked lips and cupped her face, wiping away dirt and sweat. The girl's eyelids fluttered weakly, and she murmured something in a language Jack couldn't understand. Despite his gruff demeanor, Jack's hands were steady and gentle as he lifted her onto his horse. She was light, almost fragile, and as he wrapped a blanket around her, he felt a flicker of an old buried kindness, a reminder of why he'd stayed on this land all these years, even when the world beyond seemed to forget it. Back at the ranch, Jack laid her on an old cot inside the small cabin. He fetched what little medical supplies he had, some whiskey to clean wounds, a rag for dressing, and tended to her as best he could. The girl's breathing grew steadier, but her eyes remained closed, her body weak and trembling. The night settled in with an uneasy quiet. Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the flickering light casting shadows on the rough wood walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the desert, carrying faint echoes of distant drums and the rustling of sagebrush. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension Jack couldn't shake. Hours later, as the first stars appeared in the vast sky, the girl's eyes slowly opened. They were dark and deep, filled with pain and a flicker of fear. She looked around, disoriented, then met Jack's gaze with a silent plea. Jack cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "What's your name, little one?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Ayana." The name hung in the air like a fragile promise. Jack nodded, slowly. "You're safe here." Ayana's eyes flickered with something more. Urgency, perhaps, or warning. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely audible. Jack leaned closer, listening as she struggled to form words. Apaches, danger, settlers, war. The fragments sent a chill down Jack's spine. He had heard rumors, whispers of growing unrest between native tribes and the encroaching settlers, but nothing had touched his quiet corner of the world, until now. Jack sat back, rubbing his rough hands over his face. This wasn't just a stray girl in the dust. This was a spark, one that could ignite the tinderbox of an entire land. The night deepened, and outside the wind carried on, whispering of secrets and storms yet to come. The morning sun crept over the jagged mesas, casting pale gold light across Jack McCall's ranch. The dusty land seemed almost peaceful, but beneath the quiet surface, tension simmered like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Jack sat at his rough wooden table, sipping strong black coffee, his mind tangled with worry. Ayanna lay wrapped in a blanket on a cot in the corner of the cabin, her breathing steady but shallow. Jack had done what he could, washed her wounds, fed her some water sweetened with a bit of honey, but her strength was still fading. The girl's dark eyes, when they opened, held a cautious wariness, like a deer trapped between a storm and a hunter. Jack wasn't a man used to words, and neither was Ayanna. The language barrier made things difficult, but over the hours they had developed a quiet rhythm, small gestures, nods, and looks filled with meaning. Despite the gulf between them, Jack felt a pull toward the girl, a strange sense of responsibility he hadn't expected to feel. He watched as Ayanna traced the rough wood grain of the table with slender fingers, her gaze drifting toward the window where the desert stretched wide and endless. Finally, she spoke again, her voice fragile but clear. "Apaches, danger, settlers, push, take land." Jack frowned. He'd heard murmurs of conflicts, new settlements pushing deeper into Apache territory, angry raids in distant towns, broken promises and spilled blood. But until now it had all been stories told by passing travelers or whispered in dusty saloons. He asked her, "Who's after you, Ayanna?" Her eyes flickered with pain and fear. She struggled but managed to say, "Soldiers, men with guns, want Apache gone." Jack clenched his jaw. The settlers, the soldiers, they were all the same in his experience. Greedy men hungry for land, blind to anything but their own gain. The girl's breathing grew uneven again, and Jack moved to fetch more water. He poured some into a cup, helping her drink slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. "You need to rest," he said softly. "Safe here." Ayanna nodded, but her eyes were restless, as if haunted by memories she couldn't forget. Jack sensed she carried more than wounds, secrets, fears, and warnings that stretched beyond his ranch's fences. Days passed, and the desert heat climbed higher. Jack watched over Ayanna with a quiet vigilance, his world narrowing to the fragile girl and the shadows gathering just beyond the horizon. One afternoon, as the sun burned bright and merciless, Ayanna finally spoke more of her tribe. "Apache, strong, fight to keep land, but many fall. Soldiers come with fire and iron." Jack listened closely, feeling the weight of her words settle heavy in his chest. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a battle for survival, for the very soul of the land he had come to call home. That evening, Jack stood outside the cabin, staring out at the endless desert. The wind stirred the dry grass, carrying with it a faint but unmistakable sound. Drums, low and steady, echoing like a heartbeat across the land. He felt a shiver run through him. The sound was a warning. The Apache were coming. Jack didn't know if it meant war or peace, but he knew this quiet corner of the world was about to be changed forever. Inside the cabin, Ayanna rested, her breathing steady but tense. Jack sat. Nearby, sharpening a knife, his thoughts heavy with the fragile trust between them, and the uncertain future looming like a storm on the desert's edge. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. The desert air was cool but heavy, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Jack McCall stood on the porch of his weather-beaten ranch house, sipping black coffee from a chipped enamel cup. The night's restless dreams still clung to him, a strange unease tightening in his chest. Ayanna sat inside, silent and watchful, her dark eyes fixed on the distant mesas. Jack could sense her tension, a quiet storm swirling beneath her calm exterior. The girl had been growing stronger each day, but something in the air was shifting. The desert was holding its breath. Suddenly a faint sound rolled over the red earth like thunder, but softer, deliberate. Horses, hundreds of them. Jack's heart pounded as he squinted into the distance. Silhouettes moved against the rising sun, dozens, then hundreds of riders appearing like shadows, coming alive out of the dust. Within minutes, a sea of mounted figures surrounded the ranch, forming an immense circle as far as the eye could see. The riders sat tall and silent, their movements disciplined and purposeful. Jack recognized the feathered war bonnets and painted faces, Apache warriors, hundreds strong, watching him from the distance. The ground seemed to tremble beneath the pounding hooves, the air thick with the weight of unspoken history and raw power. Jack's hand instinctively dropped to the rifle leaning against the porch railing, but he didn't raise it. Something told him these warriors were not there to kill. The chief, a towering figure atop a massive black stallion, slowly rode forward through the ranks. His face was painted with fierce red and white stripes, his eyes sharp and commanding. Jack met the chief's gaze steadily. The silence stretched taut like a bowstring, waiting to be released. The chief halted his horse just beyond the fence line and raised a hand in greeting, a gesture of peace. Jack took a deep breath and stepped down from the porch, walking slowly toward the gate. "Ayanna is your daughter," Jack said, voice steady but rough. "You sent her here," the chief nodded solemnly. "She carries our plea. The settlers push farther every day. The land that once fed our people is shrinking. We seek peace, but we prepare for war." Jack swallowed hard. He had seen greed and violence before, but this was different. This was a land cracked open by decades of broken promises, where survival meant everything. The chief's eyes bore into Jack's, filled with a mix of hope and warning. "We want to protect our people," the chief said. "And we want you to understand." Jack nodded slowly, stepping closer. The Apache warriors remained still, their hands resting near bows, spears, and rifles. The tension was palpable, but the moment was fragile, balanced on trust and a shared desire to avoid bloodshed. "I'm no stranger to loss," Jack said quietly. "This land's been hard on all of us, but I want to help if I can." The chief's stern face softened just a fraction. "Then listen, rancher. The settlers do not listen. They come with fire and iron. We will fight if we must." Jack glanced back at the cabin where Ayanna rested, then at the warriors encircling his home. The weight of the moment pressed on him like the desert heat. "We need time," Jack said. "Time to find a way." The chief nodded once, then signaled. Slowly the riders began to pull back, the circle breaking as they retreated into the desert shadows. Jack stood alone at the gate, the dust settling around his boots. The sun climbed higher, promising a long, hot day. Inside the cabin, Ayanna's eyes fluttered open, meeting Jack's gaze with something fierce, hope and fear tangled together. The calm before the storm was over. The coming days would test them all. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty. Jack McCall found himself pacing the small confines of his cabin, the weight of the Apache warrior's visit pressing on his shoulders like the relentless desert sun. Outside, his ranch stretched wide and quiet, but the silence was deceptive. Every creak of the wind, every distant bird call seemed charged with meaning. Ayanna sat near the window, her dark eyes watching the horizon where the Apache had disappeared. She was regaining strength, but the shadows under her eyes told a story of fear and loss that no amount of rest could erase. Jack had never been a man to seek company, but now he felt the strange pull of an alliance forged not out of friendship, but necessity. Late one afternoon the chief returned, this time accompanied by two other men, elders from the tribe. They came not as warriors, but as diplomats, their expressions grave but respectful. Jack met them at the edge of the ranch, extending a hand as a gesture of goodwill. "We want peace," the chief said, voice low but firm, "but the settlers push harder every day. They bring guns, greed, and fire. They do not respect our land or our people." Jack nodded slowly. "I've seen what they do. It's a hard life out here for all of us. But maybe there's a way to stop the bloodshed." The elders exchanged glances, then one spoke softly. "Our people do not want war, but we will defend what is ours. We came to ask for your help." Jack frowned. Help? What could a solitary rancher do against the tide of settlers and soldiers? But as he looked at the chief and the elders, their weathered faces marked by decades of struggle, he understood this was bigger than him. This was a fight for survival, for respect for the land itself. "We'll need to be careful," Jack said. "If the settlers catch wind of this, they'll come down hard on both of us." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice steady despite her frail frame. "My people trust you. We want to protect this land, but not with needless bloodshed." Jack felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, hope. Over the next days, Jack and the Apache leaders worked quietly, sending messages to nearby settlements and arranging meetings with local officials. Jack's ranch became a fragile bridge between two worlds, one foot in the old ways of the land, the other in the hard, unyielding reality of the settlers' expansion. But not everyone was willing to listen. Rumors began to swirl, whispers of an alliance between a rancher and the Apache tribe, stirring suspicion and anger in nearby towns. Tensions rose like a brewing storm, and Jack knew that the fragile peace they sought could shatter with the slightest spark. One evening, as Jack and Ayanna sat by the fire, he finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "What made you come here, Ayanna? Why risk everything?" She looked into the flames, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because my people are dying. Because the land is our life. Without it, we are nothing." Jack nodded, understanding more than she could say. He had lost friends, family, and hopes to this harsh land too. But this fight for survival was something that cut deeper than any wound. The night stretched on, filled with quiet determination. Jack and Ayanna, two souls from different worlds, bound by a shared need to protect the land they loved. Outside, the desert wind stirred the dry grass, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. The coming days would demand courage, sacrifice, and an alliance forged not just by necessity, but by trust. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Jack believed there might be a way through the storm. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Jack McCall awoke to the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the dry plains. It was a sharp, jarring noise that shattered the early morning calm and sent a cold shiver through his spine. His hand instinctively went to the rifle by his bed as adrenaline surged through his veins. Outside, the sky was tinged with a smoky haze, and a restless wind kicked up dust, swirling it into small whirlwinds that danced across the barren earth. The peaceful morning had turned into a harbinger of violence. Jack hurried to the porch, scanning the wide expanse of his ranch. In the distance, he spotted plumes of smoke rising against the blue sky, and the unmistakable shapes of mounted riders, moving fast. Not the silent approach of the Apaches from before, but something darker, more hostile. Ayanna stood beside him, now fully recovered but still marked by the ordeal she'd endured. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. "They come," she said quietly. "Settlers, raiders. They want to burn the land, take everything." Jack nodded grimly. The rumors had become reality. The fragile peace they had tried to build was cracking under the weight of hatred and greed. Within hours, the outskirts of the ranch were alive with tension. The Apache warriors returned, not as a peaceful delegation, but ready for battle, their faces painted and weapons sharpened. Jack stood alongside them, rifle in hand, feeling the gravity of what lay ahead. The enemy was a group of armed settlers and mercenaries, men who cared little for treaties or talks, hungry only for land and power. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they charged, firing rifles and shouting war cries. Jack took cover behind a wooden post, firing steady shots to hold them back. The sound of gunfire cracked like thunder, echoing through the canyons and shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Ayanna fought fiercely, her movements swift and precise. She wielded a bow with deadly skill, her arrows finding their marks as she moved through the chaos like a shadow. The battle raged for hours under the blistering sun. The land itself seemed to cry out with the clash of steel and smoke. Jack could see faces from both sides, young men fighting for their homes, older warriors defending their legacy, and the settlers driven by desperation and greed. As the sun began to dip low, the tide slowly turned. The settlers, caught off guard by the fierce resistance and united front of Jack's ranch hands and the Apache warriors, began to retreat, their cries fading into the distance. But the victory came at a heavy cost. Several of Jack's men lay, wounded, and among the Apache there were losses that left a deep ache in the hearts of their people. Ayanna knelt beside a fallen warrior, tears streaking her dust-covered face, her grief raw and unfiltered. Jack approached quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's not over," he said softly. "But we held the line today." She looked up, determination burning bright once more. "They will come again, stronger, more ruthless." Jack nodded. He knew she was right. The fight for the land, and for their survival, was far from finished. But today had proved something vital, that together they could stand against the storm. That night, beneath a sky thick with stars, Jack and Ayanna sat by the dying embers of the campfire. The desert was silent once more, but the air was charged with a new resolve. "We fight not just for ourselves," Jack said quietly, "but for the future." Ayanna nodded, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "For the land, for my people, for all of us." As the fire cracked and popped, they both knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but united, they had a chance to forge something new out of the dust and blood. The horizon glowed faintly with the first light of dawn, a new day, and the promise of a future still unwritten. The sun rose slow and golden over the desert, casting long shadows across Jack McCall's battered ranch. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and smoke, a reminder of the fires that had burned just days before. But something in the light felt different this morning, like a breath held too long finally released. The battle had left its scars. The fences bore the marks of gunfire, and the earth was churned with hoofprints and blood. But amid the destruction, life was stirring again. Jack moved steadily about the yard, repairing what he could, his hands steady despite the weariness that weighed on him. Inside the cabin, Ayanna tended to the wounded warriors who had stayed behind. Her face was softer now, touched by the healing power of hope, but her eyes remained watchful, always alert for the next challenge. Word had spread quickly after the battle of the unlikely alliance between a rancher and the Apache tribe, of the fierce stand against the settlers' aggression. Some called Jack a fool for trusting the Apaches. Others whispered that he was a man of honor and vision. For Jack, it wasn't about reputation. It was about survival, his, Ayanna's, and the land itself. The chief arrived that morning, riding in with a small band of warriors. His face was stern but carried a hint of a smile as he dismounted. "You kept your word, Jack," he said, his voice gravelly but sincere. "You stood with us when others would not." Jack nodded. "We both want the same thing, a future where our people can live without fear." The chief looked out over the land, his gaze steady and proud. "This land is old, and its heart is strong. We will protect it together." In the days that followed, the ranch transformed into a symbol, a place where old wounds began to heal, where two worlds met not as enemies, but as allies. Jack and the Apache worked side by side, rebuilding fences, sharing stories, and teaching each other the skills needed to survive in a land that was as beautiful as it was brutal. Ayanna became a bridge between her people and Jack's, her courage inspiring both sides to look beyond fear and hatred. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesas, Jack and Ayanna sat on the porch, watching the horizon turn shades of pink and purple. "You brought more than just yourself here," Jack said quietly. "You brought hope." Ayanna smiled softly. "And you showed that trust can grow even in the hardest soil." They both knew the fight wasn't over. The settlers would come again, and the shadows of greed and violence still lingered, but for the first time there was something stronger than fear, a chance for peace, built on respect and understanding. As stars began to twinkle in the vast sky, Jack felt a quiet pride. His ranch was no longer just a patch of land on the edge of nowhere. It was a new beginning. The desert wind whispered through the grasses, carrying with it the promise of change. A new dawn was rising, for Jack, for Ayanna, for the land they both called home.